Welcome to the Teaching Together podcast, where we celebrate the glows and grows of teacher life. I'm Sierra.
And I'm Grace.
Well, we love to take a minute to reflect on the weeks gone by. So, Grace, what is your glow or grow for this week?
Actually, this week I only have a glow, so it's been quite positive. It has just been such a joy to set up my new classroom. It's been really fun, particularly following the discussion from our first episode, which I personally found quite helpful. So that was great. And I even found a bundle of hair clips at our local TK Maxx that were shaped like dinosaurs, which if you listen to our previous episode, you will know that dinosaurs are my theme for 2024. So that was incredibly exciting and a must buy. And I'm currently wearing one in my hair right now because I'm a child at heart.
They don't Triceratops.
I think so, yes. And that was just delightful and honestly will be the highlight of my week for the rest of the year. What about you?
Well, I am exhausted because I've just come back from 5 days of camp in Jindabyne.
Wow.
I really love this camp. I went on the same one last year and it is full on, but it is such a fun way to start off the year. It's really intense and I feel really sorry for any student who it's like their first day moving to a new school.
Can you imagine?
Get on a bus and go to a place with nobody that they know.
Oh,
But that was me last year when I came to a new school.
good point.
And got on a bus with nobody that I knew and went on camp for 5 days. So I'm exhausted but buzzing from that. And yeah, really looking forward to getting stuck into the classroom. Everyone will be on high and it'll be really good.
Just riding the adrenaline straight through.
Riding all the way through.
So last episode, we looked at the culture around classroom decor and the tension between what Sierra called the two PLEs, pretty learning environments versus positive learning environments. We had a chat about our personal feelings and experiences, and we summarised some of the research that has been done into how we as teachers can create learning spaces that promote positive learning behaviours while also remaining aesthetically pleasing. And if you missed out on that conversation, make sure you head back and listen to it after this episode because it was very helpful.
I love the start of the new school year for so many reasons. Being able to set up our classrooms and rethink some of that stuff is really fun. But even just a fresh term is the perfect time to think about how you might reset your room or reflect on last year, last term, and what might need a shake-up. Routines especially are something that I like to stop and reflect on before a new term. What needs some fine tuning? What was maybe a total flop? And what was maybe on the way to working really well in my classroom? Today's episode, we're going to get into a discussion about this, both in regards to thinking routines and also classroom management routines. We all know that routines are indeed the backbone of classroom life, and it's no secret that they're an essential part of planning for effective teaching and learning. But what I have found super interesting in my preparation for this episode is how routines actually pair up with what we know about cognition and the brain, which is like my favorite topic to talk about. So, quick intro. There are two main parts of the brain that we need to know about right now. One is called the basal ganglia. If you are imagining like a cross section of your brain right down the middle, long ways, it's kind of right in the middle there.
Right.
And that's where all our routines and habitual actions are stored. Then the other part is the prefrontal cortex, which is at the front. Miraculously. And you're probably more likely to have heard of that one before.
Yeah.
That's where our attention, decision-making, and self-regulation is happening. And it can actually become quite fatigued when it reaches maximum capacity. Put a pin in that for a minute. Switch to a fresh slate in your brain. There is a model that we talk about when we're talking about cognition and memory called the modal model. And it's made up of three main sections. There's sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Or short-term memory we often also refer to as working memory. So sensory memory is like the feeder, the feed-in of all the senses that you might be detecting in your environment right now. I can taste the leftover breakfast on my tongue. I can hear my voice. I can see the light in the room, all the different things that I'm picking up. Sensory memory feeds into working memory, and there's a lot of different processes that are happening there where my brain is trying to decipher what is important for me to focus my attention on at that point in time, because not everything that I'm detecting with my senses right now is particularly relevant to what I'm doing So that's the modal model: sensory memory, working memory, long term memory, and how those three things interact. And then we have our prefrontal cortex, which can get worn out very quickly when we processing all these different sensory things and we've got lots of stimuli coming in and we're trying to just make sense of what is going on around us. So, we are trying to do with routines in our classroom is support our students in how to direct their attention. Schools and classrooms can be so stimulating, and like we talked about in our previous episode, we need to be mindful of what's in our environment so that we're not sort of creating cluttered, overstimulating spaces. And there can be so much sensory input for our brains and our students' brains to have to process and determine what is important right now and what's not. So, when we establish a routine for our classroom, we're setting up a sequence of actions to help reduce the competition for their attention and hopefully increase the likelihood that they will actually engage in the intended learning outcome set by you.
Which actually makes a lot of sense. And you can see that routines work because your brain isn't working so hard to do all of the things. That's kind of, it becomes a habit eventually. And you can actually focus on thinking about other stuff. You're not thinking, what do I have to do right now? You already know what you're doing. You can focus on the learning, which, yeah, makes a lot of sense. And from my experience, explicit and repetitive classroom management routines in particular are essential in primary classrooms if you want to stay sane, because those tiny humans with their tiny brains basically can focus on what they're doing or what they're learning, but they can't do both. And even teenagers and adults will struggle to do both of those well. But you really want to lessen the mental load on your young'uns. And when you're managing the needs and expectations of like 20 to 30 students all at once, in whatever classroom that might be, it can be really helpful to establish the ground rules of this is how we ask to go to the toilet, or this is where the pencils go that need sharpening, or when we come in after recess, we silently get out a book and read for 10 minutes. So the students just know what to do. And it saves time and things run much more smoothly and everyone kind of knows what's going on. And I've seen a huge variety of routines in action when I've been on placement or I've been casual teaching. And it just makes the day run so much more smoothly when the students know exactly how to get their whiteboards out and sit on the floor for maths, for example. So I can focus on actually teaching, or more realistically, scrolling through the PowerPoint that was attached in the email from the classroom teacher and go, what am I doing right now? But what I've also noticed is that thinking routines, which are the other type of routine we're going to be focusing on today, they tend to be less explicit and just not used as often as classroom management routines. And I definitely hadn't really considered them before we were thinking about what do we want to talk about in this podcast, to be perfectly honest. But they are super helpful. You definitely don't want to be standing up the front making sure that every student completes every activity in the same way. That's not what they're for. But there is a place for demonstrating a particular approach to a maths question, for example, and providing students something extra for their mental toolbox that they can use when they come across similar issues in other contexts. So essentially, we're using routines, whether they be classroom management routines or they be thinking routines, to create some automated behaviors, essentially, that are part of the culture of the classroom so that you can focus your energy, teacher and student, on actually learning. Yes.
I love thinking routines so much. I had not even heard of them until maybe my second year of teaching. So, no mention of it in my undergraduate study at all. And when I came across it, I was just mind blown at the simplicity, but the power of what they are and what they can help to achieve. So, I'm very excited to talk more about that. But obviously, before we dive in, we have to go get our cup of tea.
So today I've gone a bit exotic with my tea. And I've chosen what is called Limonata Rosa, which is just a fun way of saying lemon rose. And it's from this wonderful brand of tea called Tielka, Tielka, which I actually got when I was, living at home and had so much disposable income that I didn't know what to do with it. I was getting a monthly book subscription that came with tea, and I'd never heard of this brand before. And the first tea I got from them was Limonata Rosa, and it's so refreshing and it's bright pink in color, which makes it super fun. But it's just lemon myrtle with some rose petals, but it smells divine and incredibly relaxing. It's a good before bed tea. But yeah, that's what I'm drinking right now, and I'm having the time of my life.
Wow. Mine is far less exotic, just a good old Twinings, but I love their cranberry and pomegranate flavor. It is very sweet, so I don't have it too often, but I am enjoying a nice full mug of it at the moment.
Pomegranate tea is just the best.
Yeah,
Like it really is.
so
Good on you.
punchy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Amen. So, to properly kick off our discussion today, we wanted to start by looking at thinking routines. And you may be wondering, what's the point of thinking routines? Won't they limit my students' creativity? After all, my students all learn in very different ways. What if a routine just doesn't work for some of them, all of them? And those are all very valid concerns. So, I wanted to start by talking about what thinking routines are not. And in a more general way, this can be extrapolated to talk about just routines in general, but we're focusing specifically on thinking routines right now. And they are not rigid, prescriptive procedures that dictate the one way students are allowed to think. They are not designed to limit student thinking to any one particular form, and they are not intended to replace genuine discussion and debate. In fact, many thinking routines actually provide a scaffold for the kinds of discussions that can expose students to new perspectives or ways of doing things, and that's kind of what they're for. Thinking routines are designed to equip students with a variety of tools they can draw upon when a particular type of thinking is required in various contexts. And they will be able to use this specific tool because they've been instructed how to use it, because you have told them explicitly these are the steps of how to use this thinking tool. It's the same thing as being taught how to read or write or tie your shoelaces or operate a belt sander. And in a similar way, as you're instructing your students in these thinking routines, you can be teaching them the dispositions of effective learners, things like open-mindedness and curiosity and collaboration and all that wonderful stuff. And routines are important because it's impossible to model yourself on something you've never been exposed to. So how do we expect our students to become effective learners if we haven't actually taught them how to think and learn? And all of these routines are based around making thinking visible because, again, like we said in the previous episode, learning is a group activity, and these routines require students to articulate their thoughts. They need to speak through their thinking, no matter if it's kindergarten or year 12 or anything in between. And that can really help instruct students in the whole class in this routine. And thinking routines in particular serve to present students with real and effective demonstrations of what a good learner looks like because they're learning from you, and then they can scaffold their thinking until the routines become second nature, which was what Sarah was talking about with the different parts of the brain and that kind of thing. And I just wanted to mention, before we move on, this really excellent quote from Ron Richart and David Perkins, which was for Project Zero. And they had an article on why do we need thinking routines? And they said the socio-cultural character of classrooms and schools should ensure that thoughtful learning is pervasive, not sporadic. Essentially, what that means is that we learn from interacting with others, particularly those who are different from us, and these thinking routines can make sure that everyone is given a chance to think, to speak through their thinking, to get it out into the classroom, and also to make it a part of the classroom culture so that it happens all the time rather than on special occasions. And that's the only way, really, that your students are going to adopt these as habits of learning rather than my teacher told me to do this, so I'm going to do it, essentially.
I love that so much. I'm so passionate about making sure that as a teacher, I'm teaching my students how to be good learners. When I went through my most recent job interviewing process at the end of 2022, one of the questions I was asked was, you've trained in science and technology and agriculture. What kind of teacher are you? And I sort of paused and giggled and said, well, I'm just a teacher because I don't really think the context that I'm teaching in changes that. It changes what I'm teaching content wise. And so I guess it changes the context in which I'm teaching these learning skills, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm trying to teach my students how to be good learners. It just changes the context in which we're doing that thing. And so I feel so strongly about teachers not feeling like they are, holding like the golden key for how good learning works. Like our students need to understand how their memory works and what a thinking process actually looks like, and how do I unpack this question, and what do I do to articulate myself, and all those kind of things that we're trying to train them on, but sometimes we don't verbalize all of steps. We want to get them to the good outcome, but sometimes we miss showing them the the smaller processes that are involved in how to get there. And thinking routines are just such a helpful tool for building that, like you said, toolbox, which is, commonly used metaphor. But I think it's a great one. I've even thought about, uh, again, classroom decor. I don't get to do much of it, but having some tools like printouts of hammers and saws and various things with thinking routines or thinking strategies on those tools. So the hammer might, represent a particular strategy like think per share or try three before me or some sort of strategy that at some point I've taught to my class. I've modeled it to them and explained to them what it is. But then the tool on the wall is there as a visual reminder for them of like the different strategies that they can pull out of their toolbox to actually engage in learning at any given time, not just at the times when I was teaching them how to do it.
Exactly.
Well, we wanted to talk about a few examples of thinking routines that can be used in pretty much any subject and with any year group. All of these examples can be found on the Project Zero website, which we mentioned last episode. And when I first came across this website, I just was mind blown at the range of routines that were provided, and not just the names of the routines, but the resource that comes with each routine. So, what they've done on the website, if you haven't been there before, go and have a look at it. But it's divided into categories. So, what they've called thinking or like disposition categories. And so there's things like global thinking or digging deeper into ideas or introducing and exploring ideas, generating possibilities, all sorts of different categories. So, what I find really helpful is let's say I'm away for a lesson and I have to leave a casual lesson. You know, in high school, it's common to leave some kind of video documentary-ish kind of thing to watch because that can be an easy task to set for someone who has no idea about your subject area. But I don't like doing that and leaving nothing for my students to do. So I might go to the synthesizing and organizing ideas category because that will give me some routines that I could leave or some activities that I could base around a particular routine for my students to do in the meantime while they are watching. So one of the ones that I have used recently is called the 4 C's. The 4 C's stand for connections, challenge, concepts, and changes. And it comes with some different prompt questions that you could give to your students to help them think through the text and how it relates to their thinking or what they've been learning in class so far. And this was really easy for me to adapt to a film-based lesson. And I just jumped on Canva and whipped up this table kind of worksheet that had a prompt question that I'd modified a bit related to, how do they connect the different ideas from the film to what we've been learning and what should they challenge about what they're seeing in the video and what things maybe might they change about their design now that they've watched this and those sorts of things. And it just gives them a bit of a structure and some reasoning behind why we're watching this and how should I go about thinking about this in relation to what I'm currently working on. Which in our subject, everything that we do is very project based. We kind of start off with a design brief at the term and we work with that idea pretty much the whole way through. So it is very continuous and thematic and easy for them to sort of always be linking their ideas back to what our current problem is that we're working on. But the 4 C's is a really good one for synthesizing ideas. There's a whole bunch of other topics, but some of our other favorite routines, there's good old faithful think, pair, share. You may have even used that routine without knowing that it's called a thinking routine or without having encountered the Project Zero toolbox before, but that's a great strategy for getting kids to just engage with each other in what they're learning and get used to challenging each other a little bit on what they're learning sometimes. I love the, idea of, well, if you didn't think of the same thing I thought of, are we thinking of the wrong thing or are we just thinking of two different things? So that's a great one for being able to promote classroom discussion and some peer feedback, even between each other about what they're learning and what they're thinking about.
And another one that I haven't actually had the chance to use yet, but that I can definitely see myself using in a primary school classroom is something called Think, Feel, Care. So we have Think, Pair, Share and Think, Feel, Care. It's essentially an exercise in empathy. So the idea is that you're getting your class to respond to an individual or a group. This can be a real individual or group. This could be in response to a text you've been studying. It could be anything. You might be getting your students to think about, okay, there are people in the world who don't enjoy the same quality of life that I do, which is a very big idea to be dealing with in primary school. And this could be a really good way of doing that. So the first element of this routine is think. What do you think this person's role is in their context? So, what do you know about this type of person? Maybe it's what do you know about the character in this book? What do you know about this person that lives in a really impoverished area of South America, something like that? What do you think their role is in life? So, you're kind of starting intellectually rather than getting into empathy, which is hopefully a bit of an easier way to access this routine, because then you move on to how would you feel if you were this person, which is when the empathy comes in. So you're kind of thinking, okay, we've established what this person does in their world, whether this be a fictional world or the real world. How would I feel if I was this person? And that question might be really difficult to do the first time. You might have to go through this routine quite a few times to get students really empathizing with the individual or group or whoever that they're doing this routine around. Because that's quite a big question. How would you feel if you were this person? So you might need to practice that quite a bit. The last one is, what would you care about if you were this person? So for example, I'm just going to go back to pretend you're in a social sciences kind of lesson in primary school and you're looking at people who live in poverty, because thankfully we live in Australia and we are very blessed with a wonderful quality of life, and the students in our classroom probably haven't considered for a moment that their life experiences are not what everyone in the world experiences. And so this is quite a fundamental lesson for a child to learn. So you might say, okay, in India, for example, what do you think the role of a kid who your age in India would be? Do you think they go to school the same way as you? Do you think that their parents have the same values as yours? Do you think their family looks the same? That kind of things. What do you think they might eat? All that sort of stuff. Then you go, okay, how would you feel if you were a kid in this context? And then you go into, well, you can't buy a PlayStation because you don't have enough money for food, maybe, or you need to buy shoes and stuff for school. How would you feel about that? Probably not great. It's probably quite stressful. And then what would you care about if you were this person? Probably I don't care about my Roblox score because I am trying to feed myself and my family. And I just really loved this routine because of the way it made the teaching of empathy quite simple, not simplistic, but simple in that there's those 3 steps.
Accessible.
That is exactly the word. Thank you. Accessible. And I can see myself doing that with my kindergarten kids, with my 5-year-olds, which I just thought was fantastic. The next one I wanted to have a look at isn't really a routine. It's kind of just a question. But if you're brand new to thinking routines and you like, oh, actually, this sounds really good, but I have no idea how I would implement this with my students, or I'm feeling a little bit uncertain, what you can do is just start by introducing your class and yourself to the question, what makes you say that? Because essentially, if you boil it down to the absolute bare minimum, the common denominator of most of these thinking routines is what makes you say that? Because we're trying to get students to articulate their thinking for their classmates. And so if you're brand new to thinking routines, or you just think this is too complicated and you just want one step, what makes you say that can basically work after any response from a student. And it just makes them justify themselves, give the reasoning behind their response. So they're actually thinking, actually, why am I saying this? Is this because I just have an assumption or a core belief that I didn't really know before? Is it just because I thought that was the answer the teacher wanted to hear? It can actually be really helpful, especially if you're introducing your class to routines, to thinking routines. You can just say, makes you say that? Why are you saying that? And you might get a bunch of silence, and the student might go, I don't know. And that's okay too. That's really cool because you've just exposed for everyone that giving an answer that you think is correct is not enough. We actually need to be thinking.
And that justification or evaluation of your thinking is really that top level of thinking. Like if we think of the classic Bloom's taxonomy kind of triangles, that creating, justifying, evaluation, top end is the hardest part for students to articulate. And so prompting them with that right from the beginning and getting them in the habit of realizing that they have to be able to argue their point sometimes, or they have to be able to draw upon what they've learnt to, justify, which makes their answers or their responses so much more valid,
Exactly.
is a really important routine to get them started on.
Yes, exactly. And that's why it would be so useful to start in primary school, but just keep them going everywhere, I say. I love them. I really do love them. I'm so glad we're talking about them. I have one more that I wanted to address, which was the 3 whys. And this is kind of a connections kind of thinking routine. Basically, you're thinking, why might this topic matter to me, to the people around me, and to the world? And this, I was thinking, would be very helpful at the beginning of a unit when your students might be thinking, well, what's the point of this? Why am I bothering with this? You could have a brainstorm as a class before you've taught anything. You might give them, for example, the unit heading. That's something really witty and punny that you came up with that you're really proud of. And you will then ask them, okay, why does this topic matter to you? Why should it matter to you? Why might it be important that we learn this? Why might it matter to your friends, your family, the people that you actually interact with? And why might it matter to the world? And on the Project Zero Thinking Routines Toolbox, they did say that you can start this from me to the world, or you can go from the world to me. Sometimes it might actually be easier to start with why does this matter to the world? I'm thinking of like scientific stuff that is beyond my capacity to come up with an example for. But yeah, things like that that obviously matter to humanity as a whole, but maybe personal significance is a bit harder to find. And then you work your way down and say, okay, well, if it matters to the world because of these reasons, and if it matters to the people that I know because of these reasons, then you might be able to find some reasons why it might matter to you. And I just think that was a really good way of getting students to recognize the significance and the relevance and the purpose of what they're learning, because we hate it when we get kids saying like, what's the point of this? Like, why should I bother? And we want students to know there is a reason we have deliberately chosen this unit or this lesson or whatever because we think it's important and here's why. And if they're generating those answers for themselves, hopefully they will then be a little bit more invested and just a little bit more motivated, essentially.
And giving them those kinds of questions to ask to help them seek meaning in things when they may not have a teacher who they can say to, why is this important? But they might actually now have that routine or those questions that they can go to ask themselves and figure out whether something is important to them outside of the classroom, which I think is really cool. One of my other favorite routines is one that's called claim support question. It ties in so well with what we were just chatting about before in terms of justification and evaluating your responses. I find, particularly in secondary context, students are really good at describing things and they really struggle to go beyond that. They struggle to know what the difference between a describe and an explain is, and then the difference again between an explain and a justify. And there's really clear differences. And we have to, again, explicitly teach and rehearse and look at worked examples and what does a describe look like here and an explain and a justify. One of my favorite off the cuff things that I did in my classroom one day to explain this to my class, which worked so well and I use it all the time now, was I'll test it on you, Grace.
I'm ready.
Okay, Grace, tell me your favorite movie.
Letters to Juliet.
Okay, so then I would say to the class, Grace has just identified her favorite movie. What's that movie about?
It is a romantic comedy in which a aspiring journalist travels to Verona And falls in love.
Okay. And then I would say to my class, Grace has just described her favorite movie. And then I would probably say something like, but she still hasn't told me why it's her favorite movie. She's told me what it is and what it's about, but not why. And so if you're explaining something, you have to give me some sort of reasoning or cause and effect. If the effect is you love this movie, what's the cause or the reason for that? So whenever I am getting my students to answer a explain question, I ask them to get to the end and say to themselves, but why?
Yes, but why?
Because if they haven't answered the but why for themselves, then they haven't finished explaining their answer. So why is Letters to Juliet your favorite?
Because it's romance, because it involves writing, and I love to do that. It's set in Italy, and who doesn't love a romance set in Italy? The lead male love interest is British. What do I need to say? Nothing.
Well, I would argue that Grace does have more to say. If she is going to actually justify her answer, she would need to give me a whole lot more reasons about why Italy is a great city for a movie to be set in and why a British actor is the best that there can be. The point is that you can see the gradual increase in the complexity of the response. And so I ask this to my kids sometimes when I'm trying to model for them what is the difference between an identify, a describe, and explain. And they get it. They really get it. And so claim support question works similarly to break down for students kind of understanding a claim. If you're claiming that Letters to Juliet is the best movie on the planet, you need to support your answer with things that you can see and feel and know, and then question, but why? What haven't I explained yet? What about my claim raises any new issues? Is there a Letters to Juliet 2?
Alas, there is not.
I would have no idea. But maybe that movie might be better than the previous one, and you'd have to debate why the first one is better. Anyway,
I really want to have this discussion for real now. Our extra podcast, our side podcast, Letters to Juliet rewatch.
but claim support question, such a helpful routine for students to break down their thinking. What am I claiming here? What am I saying is the case? Do I have support to back up my claim? And then get in the habit of questioning myself. Don't assume that what I've written or said is sufficient. And students don't like to question themselves. They don't like to challenge themselves.
Nope.
They don't like to assume that they haven't done a good enough job the first time. And so that habit and building that routine is really, really important and fits in really well, I think, in a secondary context, especially where you're trying to build students' exam writing technique and that kind of essay writing strategies and that argumentative justification of here's what I've learned, here's why I'm right. I'm not just regurgitating words that I've learned or heard somewhere, but I can actually back up my answer. And it's been really interesting for me teaching year 11 and 12 for the first time and seeing how a lot of them are competent writers, but they can get really caught up in their words.
Yes.
So they can go on a bit of a tangent about something and still not really tell me anything about it.
Yep.
And so this kind of really, really basic breakdown of helping them to identify where's my claim, where's my support, and then questioning myself to add more detail is a really helpful routine to help them to be more concise.
Yes. And Ron Richart, who's the author of the Creating Cultures of Thinking book that we referenced last episode, he gives us two really good questions to use when we're evaluating the quality of any kind of routine we want to use in the classroom. And the first one is, what behaviors does this routine encourage? And the second is, how does it make thinking or packing up or whatever behavior you're implementing more efficient and visible? And that is basically the entire point of all these routines, is to make things efficient and visible, which is why we have to explicitly instruct our students in how they work. What I certainly noticed about each of these thinking routines is that, first of all, they're short. They've got a maximum of 3 steps. They're simple and clear sequences of actions that make sense, and they easily build off one another. And what's important is that the first action should be pretty easy to achieve. So there's a low barrier to entry, if you will, so that all students can kind of get the gist of, okay, this is where we're starting, basically. And in line with that, you need to have a cue of this is when we're going to use this routine. And that might be in kindergarten, you might say, kindergarten blue, and they might say, I'm looking at you. And then you might say, we're about to pack up. We're going to use this routine. You might have to be that explicit. When you're using a thinking routine, it might be a little bit different. Hopefully, the idea is that as students get more agile with these routines, they will be able to determine when to use them. In saying that, all your routines, whether thinking or classroom management, they need to be explicitly taught, modeled, and rehearsed. You need to practice them. You need to say to your students, we are learning this routine for this reason. Here are the steps, and this is how it works. And you need to practice it. And you might, like Sarah did with me in my favorite movie, you might need to model to your class what it looks like, which I would highly recommend, actually. I would say you do have to model to your class because they need to see it in action. Like, just as we've explained to you each of the steps of claim support question and the 3 whys and think, pair, share, you need to be that explicit with your class because, again, you're giving them a tool that they need to be able to use. And if they don't know what it's for or when to use it or anything like that, they can't make the best of it.
Just makes for a really heavy toolbox.
Exactly.
And they have to lug around and they don't know.
And that is not efficient. That is the opposite. That is inefficient. And we don't want inefficiency in our classrooms. And in saying all that, Sierra has some fantastic experience using classroom management routines. So I wanted to throw to you, Sierra, what routines have you implemented in previous classes that you want to implement next year? Or this year, I should say.
It is this year. That's a little bit scary.
Just a bit.
Look, when I was teaching science more predominantly, and obviously that has a much higher theoretical load than the subject that I'm teaching at the moment, I used to use this daily retrieval entry ticket kind of routine where I would have a pre-planned review question or retrieval question from the previous lesson that I would really quickly write on the board. Sometimes I usually actually did it as a think, pair, share, where I would give my students, say, 2 or 3 minutes where they had to write the question and their answer to the question. So we used the back of our exercise books as our kind of retrieval bank. And my idea behind these questions was that they were actually varied in challenge. So some of them might have been quite basic questions. Some of them were a bit more complex as we moved through the unit to sort of build them up with a bank of review questions and answers that they would have at the end of the topic. So we would, spend 2 or 3 minutes quietly writing their own response to the question. Then we'd go into a pair and share kind of time where they'd have another couple of minutes to chat with the person next to them. What did you write? Compare their answers. And then I'd call on a few people to share their ideas. And that would essentially be our intro to the lesson, our recap, and our springboard into what we were doing that day, which I really liked. And I don't really do something like that as much now. But again, I have to adapt to my context. So there's just not enough theory in the Year 7 and 8 technology mandatory syllabus, at least, for us to be doing that kind of what did we learn last lesson routine when really most likely last lesson we were just progressing with our project in some kind of practical way. Someone might have been painting and someone else might have been doing something entirely different. So, as I've been thinking a little bit about this and what I would like to do for this year in my transition into the lesson routine, I've been thinking of we document all of our design work in a portfolio or a folio. We usually shortcut it. And it's interesting. It's a fine line to balance because the portfolio actually weighs more than the project in terms of the assessment tasks. But you don't have anything to document if you don't have a project that you're working on. So they are really interconnected and really related to each other. But unsurprisingly, a lot of students like to focus on the practical work and leave the portfolio for the sort of last minute, and we end up with students that submit their task at the end with a half-finished portfolio, and they might have a great project, but they actually still lose a lot of marks because they haven't documented their work. And so I've been thinking of starting a routine called Folio 5. So I love a good bit of
That
alliteration.
makes me so happy. That's brilliant.
Because, so what's hard? It is such a juggle in a practical context because we don't have enough machines for everyone to be on the machine that everyone needs at the one time, right? There's 2 or 3 scroll saws and 1 drill press. And if you need that, you've got to wait in line or you've got to work out with your friends who's going next. But one of the things I always say is while you're waiting for your machine, you need to be working on your folio. So I haven't wanted to force a set amount of time on folio work before people start prac, knowing that they actually need to fall back on that if they've got nothing to do. It's hard to balance, but I think folio 5 could be really good because we all spend 5 minutes at the start. We check in, and at least they know, oh, I need to make sure that I get a photo of me doing X, Y, and Z this lesson because I've got to document that in my portfolio or whatever it is. And then I've thought that I could link that in with a PGD routine. So PGD stands for positive greeting at the door, and it's a classroom management or antecedent strategy. Antecedent is just essentially thinking about what happens in the lead up to a negative behavior interaction and working to avoid those situations. So, as an antecedent strategy, positive greetings at the door have been shown to have really great impacts on students because your first interaction with them for that lesson is a, hey, Grace, how are you going today? Not, I already told you to get started on XYZ or whatever. And one study conducted on this particular routine actually shows that teachers who implement positive greeting at the door routines have seen a 20% increase in academic engaged time.
That's not negligible.
It's not negligible. And if you add that up over a number of minutes each lesson, over a whole week, over a whole term, that's a lot more of engaged time. So I'm really battling with trying to work out the best way to implement this in my class. I tried a few times last year, literally standing at the door and greeting them all by name as they walked in. And the challenge for me with that is they'll walk in and then you obviously can't see what's happening behind you. And it's hard. You've got to have some sort of prearranged activity for them to do as they come in so that they've got something to do while you're still greeting other people at the door. But here's what blows my mind. If I set a 5-minute, say folio 5 activity for students to do while they're coming in, the person who's come in first has already had their 5 minutes by the time the person who's coming in the door last. So then what do? Do I give the last person an extra 5 minutes and then risk that the people who've come in first are kind of now getting bored and they want to move on? Anyway, I think it's really difficult to manage.
It's a hold up.
It's really hard. And when you've got that whole process happening 5 times a day,
It's exhausting.
as people are moving in and out of your room, it's a lot. So I think I'm going to adapt the positive greeting at the door routine to be a positive greeting to everyone at the door. So meet everyone at the door. Hey guys, we're all going to come in and start folio 5.
Yeah.
During folio 5, and then make my way around to each table to positively greet each student and briefly assess where they're at with their portfolio.
So everyone gets the same 5 minutes. It's not staggered. You're not turning your back on kids who are using a hacksaw for something inappropriate.
Yes, exactly that. And so, yeah, the articles I was reading about the PGD strategies did suggest possibly altering it so that your positive greetings at the desk, but regardless of where you're doing it, making it the first up thing that's happening in your lesson. And not just a greet, but having a pre-planned, pre-corrective statement that guides students through a successful transition. So knowing and reminding the students what it is that you're actually asking them to do and what the appropriate behavior will look like for the next 5 or 10 minutes or for this period or for this lesson, so that you're pre-warning and pre-reminding and structuring the lesson so that they are ready to transition, and then providing specific behavior praise statements to reinforce when the desired behavior is happening. So, thanks so much, Grace, for getting your iPad out straight away and jumping onto your polio. That's exactly what I wanted to see right now.
Yeah, we use that in primary school all the time. You go, thank you, little Joe. You are listening so well with your legs crossed. And then all the other kids go, I must listen with legs crossed. So I want to be praised. So where's my sticker? And it works like a charm.
Yeah.
Good to know it still works in high school.
It does. Actually, it is amazing. Bill Rogers is sort of an education behavior specialist, and he's written some excellent books. One of those I read a couple years ago called Cracking the Hard Class. He had some great strategies in how to sort of settle your class during a transition using words like that, like, oh, thank you so much, and praising the people who are doing the particular behaviors. And it is amazing. It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
How they all just start, following.
I want to be praised.
Yeah, it's amazing. But so I think my Folio 5 routine is what I'm keen to try this year and see how that goes.
Well, we hope that this discussion has been helpful in giving you some concrete, explicit ideas for thinking routines and for classroom management routines. And I know that I'm actually really excited to start using some of these in my own class. Make sure you check out our Instagram, which is at Teaching Together the podcast, and join our Facebook community where we're sharing our glows and grows and just all things teacher pedagogy. And make sure you hit follow on the podcast so you don't miss our next episode, which is on expectations and behavior. Bye.